Hi, this is Randall Schwartz, host of FLOSS Weekly. This week, Randy Harper joins me. We're going to talk about Apache Cloudstack, your personal infrastructure to do your own cloud stuff. Really cool. You're not going to want to miss this, so stay tuned.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit.
Bandwidth for FLOSS Weekly is provided by CacheFly at CacheFly.com.
This is FLOSS Weekly with Randall Schwartz and Randy Harper. Episode 247, recorded April 10th, 2013. Apache Cloudstack. It's time for FLOSS Weekly, the show about free, libre, open source software. I'm your host, Randall Schwartz, Merlin at Stonehenge.com, bringing you each week, well, almost each week, the movers, the shakers, the big projects, the little projects, the projects you might not have heard of, projects you may be using every day and not being aware of it. This week is no exception to that rule, but before we bring on our guests, let's go ahead and talk to Randy Harper. Welcome back as a co-host.
Hey, Randall, how's it going?
Well, apparently I'm stumbling over myself. See, this is what happens when I quit for a week and then come back. I just really don't remember how to do the show anymore. I do want to apologize. We had really built up the fact that John O'Bacon was going to come on the show last week and then do a couple of miscommunications. I totally blew it. I totally spaced it, and we didn't get to confirm until the time we had to call the show. So I'm sorry about that, but he will be back on. We'll talk about that at the end of the show. We'll say, when he's actually going to come around. Randy, welcome back to the show.
Thanks. I've actually been on quite a few times lately. It's a little bit weird.
Oh, yeah,
but I'm glad to be here.
Well, you had a period there where we were able to schedule you quite a bit, and then all of a sudden you had some scheduling conflicts, and so you went away for a while. But it's good to see you back. Thank you for helping us out. And we have a really exciting show. Sorry, go ahead.
I said I'll definitely be back more in the future.
Awesome. So we have a really great show today. We have a couple of guys, Chip Childers, hope I'm pronouncing that right, and David Nally, who are going to talk to us about the Apache Cloudstack project. Now, Cloudstack is, yes, yet another one of those ways of getting your VMs deployed in a cloud, and cloud this, cloud that. Sounds like about half the shows we've done over the past year have been something about cloud-related stuff, but that's because it's important now. People are building up these big infrastructures, and they need ways of managing those and deploying those, and it's all about infrastructure as a service and about being able to have VMs spun up with the appropriate configuration management and stuff like that. These guys, Chip Childers and David Nally, are going to talk to us about Cloudstack. Now, Cloudstack has also just come through the Apache incubator process, which means that it was started project somewhere else. In this case, I think it's cloud.com is where it started at. And it got migrated into the incubator project, which means this gets accepted. If it makes it through incubation, it gets to the point where it's a full-on Apache project, and it has just succeeded doing that. Do you know anything about Cloudstack?
I've heard a little bit about it. I've heard more about OpenStack, but I'm starting to hear more about Cloudstack, so I'm looking forward to learning more about it on the show.
Great, cool. Well, I'm sure we'll have a lot of great questions to ask these guys. So let's go ahead and bring on our guest, Chip Childers, or Chip Childers. I don't know how to pronounce that. Welcome to the show.
How you doing? It's Childers, yep.
Chip Childers. Okay, good. I probably mispronounced it a couple times on the leading up to the show, so if I please apologize. Please accept my apology for making that mistake before. Where are you speaking to us from?
I'm actually speaking to you from New York City. I'm in the WebMD office. I'm up here for the Cloudstack NYC meetup tonight, and they were kind enough to give us some space here.
Very good. We can talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but first, let's also bring on our other guest today. That's David Nally. David, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Randall. Appreciate you having us.
Great. And where are you speaking to us from?
I'm actually in the opposite corner of the building that Chip's in. I'm also in a WebMD conference room, just the other side of the building from him.
Awesome. Well, welcome to the show. So at the beginning of the show, I gave sort of my 30,000-foot overview of, or at least what I understood Cloudstack to be. So Chip, why don't we start with you about, and you give us your sort of high-level take of what this is all about.
Yeah, absolutely. So Apache Cloudstack is a cloud management platform. Its primary focus is on orchestrating infrastructure for the purpose of end users to consume virtual machines, virtual networks, et cetera. We focus a lot on trying to emulate a lot of the capabilities that Amazon provides via EC2, their VPC functionality, and we make the similar services possible for either an enterprise that wants to run it within their data center, or actually several large service providers also use the Cloudstack software.
So let's back up for a second. So cloud seems to be the word, and we've had a lot of people on the show in the last couple of years that all talk about cloud stuff. What did we do before that, and what problems is solving?
Yeah, so I mean, before that, I guess there are two different trends you can look at. I mean, on the one end, there was very simple hosting, right? Hosting was either dedicated servers or it might have been a virtual server dedicated to you, and typically it was billed kind of on a monthly basis. When we're talking about infrastructure as a service cloud offerings, what you're really talking about is a utility-based model for consumption of virtual machines, or really at its core compute resources. So storage, CPU cycles, and RAM, oftentimes bundled into that VM container. So, I mean, obviously, we've all been using virtual machines for quite some time. The infrastructure as a service software systems are really focused on self-service, metering, as well as integration and the automation of all the infrastructure underneath it to make delivery of that service easy.
Okay, so if I'm wanting to use in the old days, then if I wanted to use resources, I'd have to talk to the guys on the phone, or send an email request, and then they would set up the system. And so you're saying that this is more about I'm able to go up and instantly push a button, and within a few minutes or so, I have a virtual machine up and running.
Absolutely, and even more advanced uses of it, right? It's API driven. There are command line tools that allow you to do very similar types of things that you would do from a web interface. And I would actually say that the APIs themselves are one of the key value propositions that you have when consuming services like this. It lets you do very interesting things beyond just turning something on, and actually tying the growth of your virtual infrastructure to your application's needs. As the application maybe sees a spike in usage, it can add more web front ends, or it might be able to modify firewall rules as those new web VMs come online.
So, for example, my blog became all of a sudden really popular because it got mentioned in something like, well, I would say in the old days Slashdot, but what's the modern equivalent of that? Reddit or something? If it was
I think
mentioned,
Slashdot still has the same effect.
Okay, good. So we used to call it getting slashdotted, and I actually had a couple of my Perl articles mentioned a couple of times, and then my poor little server just burned up on that time. So you might have some monitoring service then that's watching for this kind of spike and load, and automatically spin up servers to manage that kind of a load then, right?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, the auto scaling concept is one of the newer features that we're releasing in our upcoming release. Oftentimes it takes some thought on the part of the consumer of the service to design their application to scale horizontally, and to be able to respond to load as it goes up. But absolutely, the Slashdot effect is a very good example of where maybe an individual might want to add more web servers to their blog if they need.
And just so we get some relationships going on here, what's your relationship with the Apache Cloudstack project?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a committer, a member of the project management committee, and I'm this year's vice president. So I have kind of a couple of hats that I wear, obviously. One of them is that I spent a lot of time working on release management for the project. But then I also now have a responsibility to the Apache board to make sure that we're following all of the legal rules and policies that we need to follow as a project.
Cool. David, I want to give you a chance to talk here. What's your relationship with the project?
So I actually started working on Cloudstack back when it was kind of shepherded by a startup in California called Cloud.com. And actually Cloudstack was kind of known as Cloud.com back then. And so started working on the open source project then, and am now a committer on the Apache project and working on the PMC as well.
So talk about the history of Cloud.com for those of us that aren't familiar with it.
Yeah, so a bunch of very smart guys in California saw a need for emulating AWS, and they started a startup called Cloud.com basically to build out something that could be used in place of AWS, someone who wanted to offer a similar service, whether that be for the enterprise or something else as a service provider. And I think the understanding was clearly evident that open source was the way to go. So pretty rapidly back in 2010, Cloudstack was open sourced, and it was available under the GPL v3 at the time, and really had a very short pre-open source life. So there were some production deployments in 2009, but really took off in 2010. That company got acquired by Citrix in 2011. And then Citrix rapidly did a number of things. First of all, as a lot of startups do, Cloudstack was kind of following that open core model. So Citrix open sourced it all. And then a couple months later, they changed the licensing from GPL v3 to the Apache license. And very shortly thereafter, worked on donating it all to the Apache Software Foundation and getting Cloudstack into the incubator project at the ASF.
And I understand that that's now actually complete, that this is now a full-fledged project of the Apache Foundation.
Yeah, we graduated, I want to say it's March the 20th. So we became a top-level project then. And the incubation project was very interesting to go through. A lot of change from the process standpoint. Obviously, Cloudstack had been around at the time for about 4 years as a code, so it was pretty mature from a code perspective. But essentially, it was focused on aligning our processes with the way the ASF does things. And ensuring we met the community standards that the ASF has for projects that are bearing the Apache name.
Now, when it was originally created, or at least when it was originally open source, it sounded like it was the GPL v3, and then it was migrated to the Apache, the more permissive Apache license. What implications does that have for someone who wants to use this or contribute to it?
Well, obviously, it's far more liberal. The Apache license gives you a lot more freedom for redistribution. For an end user, it's really there really isn't a whole lot of difference, right? So you essentially are free to use it in any way under both licenses. There were some things that scared folks, particularly the patent provisions of GPL v3 were a constant roadblock for folks, particularly with larger legal departments. So that stopped a lot of contribution from coming in, and I was actually shocked because I've traditionally been a copyleft mindset as far as my FLOSS involvement, and I was shocked at how the change in license alone really shifted the thinking of folks who were interested in contribution.
How so, though?
Essentially, for some of the large enterprises, GPL v3 was banned outright by legal departments. So we were not even in consideration as a piece of software they would consume, much less contribute to. I don't know that culturally that we've done a good study of how the licenses affect, but I think that it kind of removed some of the concerns that folks would have around constraints, and particularly the patent thing continually was brought up by some of the larger folks who were wanting to get involved. And so I think that it assuaged some fears, and not necessarily from the direct contributors, but from their employers.
Yeah, you know, I've often said I really appreciate that Richard Stallman has been out there, along with many others, pioneers as well, but that Richard's position is a very strong position way out to the, I don't know whether left or right would be appropriate here, but way out that way, okay? And, but it does hinder, you know, it does actually, there are organizations that I personally worked in that said we can't really bring any GPL stuff in for fear of things of being tainted that we need to ship or whatever. And so if you really want your code to be more widely used, you should use a more liberal license for that. And I'm glad there are Apache licenses and the Perl license and a bunch of other things that are all very much in that area. So I'm glad you also observed the same thing.
Yeah, the permissive nature of of the Apache license is really incredibly commercially friendly, and I did not realize the impact that it would have until we went through it. I've been really impressed by how folks are willing to jump in on permissively licensed things, even though contributing back is not a requirement.
Chip, back to you for a second, just so we get David a chance to rest his throat for a second. I actually have no idea why I'm asking either of you guys either of these things, but I'll just continue as if I know what I'm doing here. So, Chip, how is Cloudstack being used? Is it mostly being used for companies' internal infrastructure, or are there more service providers using it, or do you have any way of telling?
Well, the Apache project officially doesn't necessarily track usage, right? So it's free to download, free for anyone to use. I can tell you through just conversations and some of the information that the Citrix marketing folks obviously have published. Cloudstack's used in a number of different scenarios. So anything from a small lab environment where you might have a group of developers and you want to just let them spin up VMs very, very easily, work on something, trash the VM, and kind of checkpoint and go back to something else. It's a great lab management tool, but it also scales to, I believe the largest known deployment right now is somewhere in the order of about 30,000 hosts under management.
Wow.
So those are servers. Certainly a large number of service providers are using either Cloudstack or a commercial derivative of it. You can point to British Telecom, Tata Communication, KT, DataPipe, SunGard, my employer, a few others as well. So it really is adopted. It's been adopted across a broad spectrum and everything kind of in between. I can give you another example of kind of a web type company. Spotify makes use of it for all of their dev and test infrastructure, and they have an environment both in the US as well as one in Europe for their teams. So it's a very flexible solution, and it could be employed to be useful in a small environment, but it can also be employed to be used by a service provider that wants to provide a global service.
One of the features I've seen in other cloud systems like this, cloud stacks like this, using the term generically now, is that you can have a local infrastructure and then burst out to commercial providers somewhat transparently. Does that work as well with this?
Well, so that isn't necessarily the responsibility of Cloudstack itself, or frankly any of the kind of the similar ones. So OpenStack, OpenNebula, Eucalyptus. What they're responsible for is really dealing with a particular set of infrastructure and providing APIs to consume it. If you're talking about an environment where you want to be able to consume that service, but you might want to consume a number of different clouds, that's where you'd look at one of these aggregation type tools. And if we're talking about the open source world, you might be looking at a scaler. You might also be doing it yourself by looking at whatever application binding that you want to use to drive your infrastructure. Let's say you're writing an application, in Ruby. There are different Ruby libraries that can talk to numerous cloud APIs underneath it. So you have to basically solve that problem above the layer that Cloudstack focuses on.
Okay, that makes it more clear for me. And since you mentioned a bunch of other places like that, how would you distinguish this from the many similar offerings then?
So the way I look at it is each one of, and I think there are roughly 4 major cloud management platforms in the open source world that are being worked on. Right, these are very active projects. Cloudstack, obviously, that's the one that David and I work on. OpenStack, I guess generally as a foundation, is working in the space, and some of their projects, when put together, kind of create an apples to apples comparison with Cloudstack. OpenNebula and then Eucalyptus are actually very similar to Cloudstack. Now they're all different because they're going to focus on solving different problems. I think if I could just summarize OpenStack, I'd say that it's a set of discrete projects that can be put together in a set of different combinations depending on what the provider wants to do. Whereas Cloudstack is really focused on doing the orchestration very well, certainly having plugins to drive different types of infrastructure underneath it, but it's a kind of a simplified deployment, simplified model, which makes operations a lot easier. And it also lets us work very well in both that small environment as well as the large service provider environment.
Very good, very good. Sorry, I got distracted here. Yeah, it does. So how small is the smallest setup that makes sense? I mean, is this useful for, like, if I just have a couple computers that are sitting over in the corner and I want to launch VMs on them?
Well, so useful, I guess, is a relative term.
Yes.
Useful to a developer of Cloudstack is a single virtual machine that that we deploy, or that we have. We call it DevCloud. DevCloud is a single VM. You can boot it within VirtualBox on your laptop. There's also a KVM-based variant, and within it actually will run the Zen hypervisor, and then you can run tiny Linux VMs inside of that. Now, obviously, that's a micro cloud, not necessarily useful beyond anything other than developing for Cloudstack or experimenting with it, or giving a demo, et cetera. What I've seen is that a handful of servers, are very frequently, labs have a handful of servers, and the handful of servers will be running a hypervisor. And so you'd want to employ something like Cloudstack as a very easy way to provide self-service to the dev team that might be using it. So it could be that very, very small environment. Again, it could also be the very large, provider scale environment.
So what does this look like as a user of it then? Is there a web API and a web UI of some kind, and then maybe some command line tools as well?
Yeah, there is. There's actually, I'd say, a really great web UI. It's got all the nice smooth edges that you'd expect from a well-designed interface. Both the platform administrators and the end users can log into that. And of course, there's also that API that I talked about. So there's a HTTP-based API that is native to Cloudstack. In addition, we have a feature where you can very easily turn on. It's just a global setting. You turn it on, and EC2-based APIs are then exposed as well. They're exposed on an alternate port. But if you've got tooling where you might be working with Amazon EC2 for some of your application deployments, you could very easily bring Cloudstack in, or point to a Cloudstack provider that's also turned on that EC2 API and consume it in the exact same way.
Good. So I could actually migrate my stuff out of the expensive cloud to maybe my own hardware, as long as it provides that same sort of interface.
You could. I mean, there's a little bit more of a challenge there when you think about what's in the VM image itself, right? So you need to be able to convert from, whatever hypervisor you're using locally over to the appropriate Amazon AMI format. But there are tools that you could use for that. And so that API compatibility is really useful for that kind of the virtual infrastructure control point, and having that compatibility available.
How Linux requiring is this infrastructure? I mean, I keep seeing Linux being the host of the machines, and Linux instances being spun up. But what if I have a need for, say, Windows? Oh, sorry, wrong show. But anyway, Windows or FreeBSD or something like that on the guest operating system. Would those be deployable with this?
Yeah, the guest operating systems. It's really entirely up to the both the combination of the guest operating system and the hypervisor that's being provided. Cloudstack supports KVM, it supports Zen server, it supports the ESX, or the vSphere, VMware proprietary hypervisor. We're also working on bare metal provisioning, which means we can, when a user requests a machine, we'll be able to actually provision a physical server dedicated to them. So we support a number of different hypervisors that make things easy for you to select as the provider. Now, as the consumer, most of those hypervisors also support Windows, right? That they support all kinds of different operating systems. Mm-hmm. And there really isn't a reason why you have to think about this as just a pure Linux environment. One other note is that the other proprietary hypervisor out there, Microsoft's Hyper-V, it's gaining some traction, just simply because Microsoft's giving it away when you buy Windows servers, and so we are working for a future feature release where we'll be enabling Hyper-V management support similar to KVM, Zen server, et cetera.
And what does the development community look like for this, especially now that you've gone through Apache incubation and have graduated that? What is it? How does the community work?
Well, the community works in a very similar way to the way all of the Apache projects work, right? So there's the Apache Foundation has a bit of a mantra that all decisions happen on the list, and they mean the mailing list. We obviously have IRC at our disposal. We do a little bit of real-time communication via that, but really it's a very active email-based collaboration environment. The community, since both since entering incubation, I actually joined the community after it entered incubation at Apache, and then over the course of the incubation process, and now that we've graduated, has been steadily growing. I would say that it's an interesting mix, actually, of probably three different types of contributors that join up and participate. First and foremost, users of the software, because the software has been around for quite a while, as David said. It's very mature and it's deployed in a large number of environments. The users of the software have been moving into the community in order to help either with their pet bug that they want to fix, their pet feature that they want to add to. In some cases, they just show up and say, "Listen, I've been using this software for a long time. How can I help?" Right. So the users are an integral part of the community, and I'd say that one of the strengths of Cloudstack is that we've really drawn in users to become contributors and committers and project management leadership for the project. The other two types of users, or the types of contributors that we've also drawn in, are around the first one would be the vendors, right? So a lot of infrastructure vendors, whether we're talking about an SDN company like Nicira or Big Switch or Metacura, each one of those companies has a vested interest in seeing their technology have an appropriate plugin that Cloudstack will be able to use to drive their infrastructure or drive their particular technology. We're also seeing different storage companies, Basho. Now, all of those companies are effectively, what they're doing is they're sponsoring individual contributors, right? Because within Apache projects, it's all about individual contribution. But they sponsor developers' time and say, why don't you go help and figure out how you can be helpful, or go build this plugin within Cloudstack and work with the community to get it accepted. And the third type of contributor that really was, I guess it shouldn't have been surprising to me, but it was. Is I'd almost call them just the broader Apache community. For example, we switched from Ant-based build tooling to Maven very early on, kind of in our incubation process. And the value of the Apache community was that some of the leaders of the Maven project were right there with us, helping us get that set up correctly and make the best use of it. So that type of broader Apache community support between the projects, and within the projects is something that's also been really fantastic.
Thanks. That was a great answer. That's a nice long answer too. I like long answers. I have plenty of time to think of the next question. Actually, I came up with a question for David. The history of Cloudstack and before cloud.com, cloud.org, cloud.something, cloud.com.
It was cloud.com.
It went from a proprietary project to an open source project, and then owned by a different owner, and now it's part of Apache. What's sort of the biggest change in sort of the overall direction of Cloudstack over that time? There must have been definitely some like left turns and right turns in that path.
Oh, sure. So, the entire open source, I think, was a given. I think the folks at cloud.com realized that there would be no large-scale adoption without it being open source, because any of the exciting technologies, whether that be SDN or virtualization or cloud computing, seem to be dominated by open source, and it's really been a shift in thinking. Open source used to be about copying proprietary, whether that was Linux beating out Minix and Solaris, or Samba providing alternatives to Windows file servers, to now that being the default choice. So I think that open source was an assumption. The I think the big left turn was making that shift from GPL to the Apache license. That was the first one. The biggest change, quite honestly, as far as disruption, was moving to the ASF because process that had been in place for 4 years was now essentially thrown out the window, and you got to figure out the right way to do things. Those water cooler conversations are no longer acceptable at all. While folks knew that they weren't necessarily good when the project was open source, but not at the ASF, it really became a mandate, and so that was quite disruptive. In a good way, long term, it ended up being very very beneficial. Essentially, as one of my friends has quoted 38 Special saying, "You have to hang on loosely, or you'll lose control." And because of being able to essentially push all of those decisions out to the mailing list, I think that's been a wonderful thing for community growth. It's allowed a lot of folks to come in and essentially take ownership in areas that would have been completely opaque prior to the move to the ASF.
Yeah, because it's definitely different changes in process. But could you have foreseen where version 4 was back when you were working on version 1, or has that taken a turn as well?
No, from a development standpoint, most of the folks who've been working on it from version 1 have essentially said that there have been 3 rewrites since version 1, and that's very true. And I think there's while a lot of those so-called rewrites are really larger scale refactoring, I think that in many ways we were almost following the semantic versioning without intending to, because 1 to 2 was a dramatic shift. Version 1, we essentially tried to fork Zen and write our own hypervisor and combine that with Solaris and ZFS to essentially provide what was really a black box. And folks like choices in hypervisors, so that didn't work. And so then it became consuming the upstream hypervisors as part of that move to version 2. And then we've seen, Chip talked about some of the larger scale clouds being at about 30,000 physical hosts. We're starting to see a lot of work focusing on scaling a lot past that, because while the current model will scale to that and handle that very effectively, when you start thinking another order of magnitude out, you're going to have to start using some different strategies to keep up with that scale. So we've seen a lot of movement from version 3 to 4 and 4.1 being focused on making things a lot more scalable if they need to be, while hopefully keeping the simplicity of the installs if you're only running a couple of hosts or even a couple of hundred hosts.
Wow. Okay. So earlier we talked a little bit about the sort of the competing things in the same space. Are you guys cooperating and coordinating at all, or at least being inspired by the other things that are going on in this area?
I think you can't. I think you can't help but be. We're certainly learning from some of the things that we see others doing. We've talked frequently with some of the other communities like Open Nebula and Yucca about and OpenStack about trying to coordinate things like EC2 compatibility tests to essentially, if everyone is trying to emulate the EC2 API, the underlying test bed for that should be pretty similar. We've openly talked about that. We have pretty frequent communications with a number of contributors across a lot of the infrastructure as a service projects, and also things that are slightly up and down the chain from us. So, we're constantly talking to the folks from projects like JClouds and Fog that are API abstraction layers. We're also talking to the folks from the hypervisors on a pretty regular basis, figuring out where they're going, what's coming next, and what we need to be preparing for. But those aren't necessarily official project communications, but more, developer to developer things that ended up coming back to the mailing list and hoping to help inform some of our decision making.
I'm presuming that some of the things you're trying to be compatible with, like say S3 and EC2 and those things, might change over time. How are you able to keep up with those changes to keep compatible, or are you just aiming at implementing a subset, or what?
So there's obviously a core subset that we're focused on, and we're also ensuring that our focus is on making sure that the tools that consume it work. So it's great to have perfect API fidelity, but if the tools that everyone is using don't work, then what's the point? So, for instance, with EC2, we're focusing on making sure that things like Bodo, which is a client library for the EC2 API, works. We're also trying to make sure that things that are commonly consumed in EC2, like CloudInit, which is essentially a guest side configuration tool to set things like passwords or SSH keys, work inside Cloudstack. So yeah, there certainly is a focus. We would love to have support for every single API set that AWS produces, but really the focus is on making sure that it's consumable first, and that we're matching fidelity close enough that the tools can actually consume the service, and then working on expanding that reach.
And
another point to consider there? I'm sorry. Another point to consider there is that it's in Amazon's best interest actually to maintain at least a level of stability in their APIs. So while they're obviously introducing new services all the time, and they're an engine for a lot of our industry. That introduction of new services oftentimes is in a complementary service environment, right? So for example, Route 53 for DNS service, that doesn't necessarily modify the EC2 APIs. So a good way to think about them as kind of a target to model is that they have a very big ecosystem, large number of integrations into their services. And they do a fairly good job of trying to remain stable so that they continue to drive customers into their environment.
Now, other than the things, I think we've covered a lot of the things that Cloudstack includes in terms of other open source software pieces, but is there any other components that we haven't mentioned yet that we're actually leveraging off other people's projects?
Oh, there's quite a bit of that. We do include the Java bindings for Zen. For Zen server in our source code. What we really try to do though is leverage as dependencies any library that's available to talk to some type of technology. So for each one of the integrations we've got, we have some type of either dependency, or we've had to handcraft perhaps an API wrapper that sits in our code base. The list of technologies that Cloudstack can automate and orchestrate is really long, frankly. I listed out the hypervisors. On the storage side, we can work with Ceph. Obviously there's NFS-based integration. We do iSCSI for primary storage. Our secondary storage can be backed by any S3 compatible provider, and that includes things like RyaxCS from Basho. Within the networking space, there's the Open vSwitch integration. Our 4.1 release is going to include supporting OVS for KVM, whereas in our 4.0 release it was really just in the Zen server environment. So for each one of compute, networking, and storage, the list of actual plugins and integrations is quite large.
Cool. And then I was just going to ask about Ceph, because we have Ceph coming up on an upcoming show in a few weeks. So as long as it has the right interfaces, you can go ahead and deploy all that then.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I think, David, that's probably one of the first significant non-Citrix contributions once Cloudstack started in the incubator. It came from one of our other PMC members, Guido. He had been a longtime Ceph user, found Cloudstack, wanted to make sure that he could deliver his hosting services using Cloudstack and Ceph as an underlying storage, and so he spent the time to write that driver and continues to kind of iterate on it and improve and add features to it.
Yeah, I think that was the first really large contribution that we had once we were at the ASF, and it's interesting. Ceph, Cloudstack can consume Ceph in a couple of different ways. The first is for virtual disk storage. So these virtual machines have a disk image that they spin up, and you can run that off of Ceph. You can also use it for essentially Cloudstack's internal object store, where it stores templates and snapshots, because Ceph exposes an S3 interface as well. So you can use the object store side of Ceph in that manner also.
So you mentioned something about Cloudinit. Sorry, but can you explain that a little bit better?
Yeah, so Cloudinit runs on the guest operating system, and when the guest boots up, essentially it starts, and it's querying metadata server. So in EC2, there's a range of addresses that it will query, and it will collect metadata. And Cloudstack essentially offers very similar services, and so Cloudinit goes out and will query what is effectively a metadata server that could potentially offer things like passwords for different accounts, SSH keys. And so essentially when your machine comes up, it doesn't have to have a password set, and it's not going to be some default password that anyone could log into. It'll be set to whatever you've configured the machine to have through Cloudstack. So it's just reaching down another level of orchestration into the guest operating system, and trying to orchestrate that little base level of configuration across a number of different platforms.
So how's the machine defined in that metadata? I mean, are you using Puppet? Is it using Puppet at all?
So Cloudinit has some plugins that will use Puppet or Chef and pass some configuration onto them. So if you wanted to specify a Puppet server or something of that nature, you could certainly do that. But really, it's hopefully helping you bootstrap whatever environment, because the thought would be that, especially if you're consuming this from a service provider standpoint, you're not going to have control over the base templates necessarily, but you still want to be able to reach in and say, hey, I'm a Puppet user, or I'm a Chef user, or I don't use either, and I just want to be able to set root SSH key. And so it's really more of a bootstrapping tool than it is a real configuration management tool. But hopefully it bootstraps you into config management.
So I'm basically defining for a machine I'm trying to start its base image and sort of some properties about the machine I want, like whether it's a small instance or big instance, things like that. What's the interface for that? Am I editing a text file to manage that, or is this some sort of GUI interface or some API call? How does that work?
So you've got a number of options. You can do use the web interface, which essentially leads you through a number of choices, like what availability zone to place the instance in, what disk image or CD ISO you're going to launch, the amount of resources, so number of CPUs, the speed of the CPUs, how much RAM, and then of course storage how much storage you want with it. And you can do that through the web UI. You can use command line tools. You can make API calls. And of course, both the command line tools and the web interface are really just making API calls. And you can even do things. So there are plugins for Knife, which is Chef's provisioning tool. There are native resources and types in Puppet, so you could have machine definitions in a Puppet manifest. There's iPad apps. There's Android apps. And again, it's really all coming back to anything that can make an API call. Someone even wrote a bash script. Someone in Japan wrote a bash script recently to make those API calls.
So you've mentioned a lot of things here. It sounds like you guys have made a lot of progress since you first started, and you said there were 3 revisions. What are you seeing in the future? What's the roadmap look like?
So the roadmap's something that evolves all the time. We have visibility into feature proposals probably out through close to the end of the year. Continued integration of new infrastructure technologies, enhancements to those capabilities. There's the track of work around continuing to increase the amount of EC2 services that Cloudstack can support. Example to that would be we've been talking about CloudFormation. If you're not familiar with EC2 or Amazon's CloudFormation service, it allows you to use kind of a metadata structure and define how you're going to consume the individual compute and storage resources. So you can send in a request that says spin up 20 web servers in one shot, and kind of they're tied to these load balancing rules, and it has this network ACL policy wrapped around each one of them. So we're looking at improving and continuing to grow kind of the EC2 like feature sets. We're going to continue down a path of some of the internal architecture being refactored, really to make it so the Cloudstacks. This goes back to David's point about deployment scale, and scale of management. The more that we can tease apart and distribute the different layers inside of Cloudstack's core, the more capability we're going to have in terms of scaling the system for larger and larger provider environments. So I saw the web scale joke on the IRC. Yeah, certainly. But really, it is actually about how do we take this solid, well-tested core product and find a way to continue to sort of tease out and distribute horizontally, as well as geographically, for the purpose of the providers that might be offering services in Asia, Europe, North America, kind of all in one unified environment.
And is this project big enough now to have its own conferences?
We actually we do. We had our first Cloudstack collaboration conference last year. I guess it was in the fall of last year. I'm not sure if the dates are ready to be announced yet for the 2013 conference, but we have one currently being planned. And also there's talk about having a second one. The first one will be in North America, having a second one later in the year over in Europe.
And I imagine you have a presence at places like OSCON and things like that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll give props to the Citrix community management team, which David's part of. Those guys who not only participate in the community and in terms of helping with documentation, bugs, release management, all the things that you do as an individual contributor. They're traveling all the time. So look them up. They're probably in a user group or a conference near you.
Great. And what kind of people are you looking for? Are you have particular needs of kinds of volunteers or kinds of contributions that you're seeing more lacking in?
Yeah. So, I've been asked this question recently. Everyone's welcome, and we have more than enough work across a number of different areas, right? So if you're interested in open source product marketing, we've got a list for that. If you're interested in helping to understand the code and work on bugs, we've got bugs to fix. I would say that if I could have anything right now, I'd love to see an increase in in technical doc writers, number one, because the team we've got has done a fantastic job, but there's a lot more that we could do to really improve the operator and the installer experience there. And the other area would be just continue to ask that users of the software come join the community, even if you're not software engineers. Testing new releases and new features is an area that we always need help with. And the more diversity and the more actual user feedback that we get during the during the test process, the better it's going to be for them in the end when we roll it out.
Very cool. We're almost out of time, but is there any questions we didn't ask that you want to make sure our audience gets the answer to?
Yeah, I'd say, I guess one point I'll make is that we do have a new feature release coming out shortly. And that timeline is, as I've been saying, it's literally any day now. The last couple of blocker bugs are being burned through. When that happens, the community will start its voting process and kind of release finalization. So I'd look for a Cloudstack 4.1.0 release real soon now. And
David, same question to you.
I think I would say, and I know it's been on the banner beneath our names. Come find us at cloudstack.apache.org, or come find us in IRC at #Cloudstack. We'd love to help you make progress with using Cloudstack, and there's lots of people who are there to help you.
I'm presuming you're saying that's on Freenode. You didn't actually mention that,
yes,
but there
I'm
are
sorry.
other
It's on Freenode.
Everything's there now anyway. I don't know why I even have to keep talking about it, but you want to make sure that you go to the right IRC network. Very good. The final two questions, which I always ask all my guests. If you've heard my show before, you know this is true. David, first to you, your favorite scripting language.
In deference to you, it used to be Perl, but I'm essentially doing a lot more Python now, and it's kind of become, because I'm interacting with it so much, it's kind of become my default.
I understand. Everybody has choices to make, and they do. And your favorite text editor?
It's VI, and I make no apologies. I'll even flash the VI gang sign.
Oh, okay. That's fine. I understand that. Back to you. Oops, what's your name? No, Chip, back to you. Sorry. I scrolled up, and your name was off the top of the screen. I went, I don't know. I can't remember his name. Sorry.
Don't worry about
Chip.
it. What's your name again?
Randall, I hope.
So I'm actually going to answer very poorly because David already answered for me. Actually, I'm a Python guy. I am spending a bit more time with Ruby recently, but I do default to Python.
Okay.
And yeah, Vim for me.
Fine.
TBI.
Yeah. Guys, y'all teaming up against me, and my editor can emulate your editor. That's all I know. Okay. Anyway. Yeah. Well, guys, thanks for coming.
I'm waiting for the Cloudstack emulation in Emacs, though. So yes, I know that can't be far off.
Boot Cloud Init directly inside Emacs or something. That'll be pretty amazing. So, guys, really want to thank you for coming on and talking about this real emerging area of cloud and what you're doing with that. And really happy that you made it as a full-fledged project in Apache. And I'm happy you're coming out with new releases. So thanks for being on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Very cool. I did that almost in unison. That was great. That was look at my stupid. That was Chip Childers and David Nelly speaking to us about Cloudstack. What do you think there, Randy?
That was actually really cool. I wish I could have commented more, but past employer makes it a little bit tricky.
That's okay. I think I asked enough of the interesting questions for you. You were typing questions at me in the chat room too, so I was helping as well. So I appreciate that. Although I usually kind of count on my co-host to have a little bit more question time in, but that's okay. That's okay. We get to chat about it afterwards. So again, as I said in the show too, it's like this is a really emerging area. It's a really interesting thing, and I'm glad there's so many solutions in this space that are all good open source solutions so people can do stuff. I'm even told that my current client, Nami Media here, is using Cloudstack as part of their deployment for the dev of VMs. So it's near and dear to what I'm doing right today.
Yeah, it's really great watching this blow up. I mean, first I heard about OpenStack. That was about a year or two ago when I heard about them. And then I started hearing about Cloudstack, I guess it was earlier this year. And it sounds like they're getting more and more popular. And a lot of people are looking to these types of solutions, which is fantastic.
Very cool. Very cool. Well, speaking of other solutions, let's look at the upcoming guest list. Let's see here. So, oops, I got to scroll the other direction. His name was way up at the top of my screen, and now it's back down to the bottom where all the upcoming guests are. So next week we have Pootle, which is the online translation management. This is their third reschedule, so hopefully they'll actually be on this time. I'm sure they are. We just had some miscommunication on the last couple of times, that's all. And immediately following that, if you want to compare that software to Weblate, which is also online translation. The importance of online translation is that you can put up the source code to your files or something, and they have people who actually speak that language be able to incorporate the messages and drop them back down. And so it's very useful to have that sort of thing available on the web, and that's why there's a number of solutions in this space already. Then, as I mentioned but towards the beginning of the show, we are going to have Ceph come on. That's a distributed object store and file system designed to provide excellent scalability. It's web scale. Yes, definitely. So we'll talk to the Ceph guys. And then, yes, the rescheduled John O. Bacon show. As I said in the beginning of the show, we had a last-minute miscommunication, and so he didn't come on last week, and so we canceled the show. Sorry about that. I really like to keep my shows every week, but sometimes it's just not possible. But he'll be back. It's rescheduled a little bit later in Q2. He'll be talking, of course, about the Ubuntu phone, so that'll be great. I'm still sending out a lot of emails for Q2, so I still am filling slots, getting all that put together. It's a real, there's a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes of this show. I'm sure you all can have a sense of that by the fact that I keep the schedule so full all the time. But I occasionally get lazy and I forget to send out my emails I'm supposed to be sending out every weekend. Okay. But if you want to see who's coming up, we've got twit.tv/floss. If you go there, that's the homepage for the show. From there is a spreadsheet link, a Google spreadsheet that I try to keep up to date, which tells you who we're actually talking to get on the show. If you have a project that is not on that list, have the project maintainer or the lead development or whatever you relate to the project, have them email me, merlin@stonehenge.com. I make that address very publicly available. It's also listed right there on twit.tv/floss. And I will put them on the list. If you get a project leader to email me, it goes right to the top of the list. I try to get them in first. So that's the key to getting on quickly. You can follow us at Floss Weekly on Google+, and at Floss Weekly on both Identica and Twitter. We have a live chat room. We had a couple of questions from the chat here today. We do that on live.twit.tv. You go there at 8:30 a.m. Pacific time on Wednesdays, and almost every week we do, in fact, have a show. You can follow me at Merlin, M-E-R-L-Y-N, on Twitter, and Randall L. Schwartz on Google+. I now have about 21,000 Google+ followers, and have regular dialogues with them about all sorts of things, including my successful weight loss. I am now 45 pounds lighter than I was 6 months ago. My waist has gone from size 38 to 32, and my blood pressure is now normal, and I'm feeling great, and I have lots of energy all the time. I actually did a discussion about that. I mentioned it in the past show, but I did actually finally do the interview with Tony Smith, who is also of Starship Sofa fame. If you go to Technically Fit and Healthy, all one word, technicallyfitandhealthy.com, episode 5, my interview starts around 41 minutes into the show. He has like a news show, and then he actually interviewed me for about another 40 minutes. So if you want to know about low carb, high fat, or a ketogenic diet, the thing that I did, it's also a thing that Steve Gibson was talking about in terms of his program. And in fact, I've actually had some suggestions from people that I get together with Steve and do a health show. So we'll see if that ever comes about. But we're both busy people. We'll see how it goes. That's probably enough plugging for me. Randy, what do we have to plug today?
Nothing really to plug. I think I'm coming up on a show again, co-hosting next month.
Yes,
I have to check.
Yes, you'll be back. I think you're co-hosting when I'm not here. Actually, I should. That's news. I forgot to do that. I'm going to be away on a cruise in about 3 weeks. But luckily, Dan Lynch and you have both stepped up to say yes, we'll cover the show for you. So we don't have a guest on that one yet, but we will have a guest soon. I just have to work out the schedule for that. Anything else?
No, that's it.
All right. Well, thanks for stepping in and co-hosting the show today. And looking forward to co-hosting with you on a future show, or however the configurations end up working out. So we'll see you all again next week on FLOSS Weekly.